So I lead our government affairs and policy at the American Society of Civil Engineers. I am not an asset management expert, but what we're really doing at the Civil Engineers, first of all, we represent 150,000 civil engineers around the country. I know several of you in this room are active in ASCE, working on transportation, water, ports, energy, and more. And we have a small government affairs team as well. We do lobbying at the national and state level, a little bit at the local level, media relations and policy. So I will start out with a little bit on the report card, just as some stage setting, and then talk about a little bit about the infrastructure bill. It's almost been 1 year since we've had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and talk about where we see asset management practices and O&M strategies in place in that bill. So as you're probably aware, since 1998, over 20 years, we've been doing this infrastructure report card. And why do we do it? It's really a non-technical audience we're looking to reach. We do about a year or more of deep analysis with senior experts from across the society in each of these infrastructure categories that you see. So a lot of robust research goes into it, but at the end of the day, we boil it down into letter grades that your mom, your grandma, your son could understand. And we're really trying to make what has traditionally been an out of sight, out of mind problem resonate with kind of the mainstream public. So that's why we started in 1998. It was the 10-year anniversary of a congressionally mandated report on the nation's public works. And here's where you see we were in 2021 with the last report card. Overall, we were excited to celebrate that we had reached a GPA of a C- out of 20 years in the Ds. I'm a parent. I would not be celebrating a C-. But nevertheless, you have to hit some milestones, make some progress. So all those green arrows that you see are grades that rose from 2017 to 2021. You can see aviation, drinking water, energy, inland waterways, ports, just to name a few. So overall, and I know many of you are infrastructure asset owners, hopefully this resonates with you. Perhaps you're in a better place, but overall, kind of the trends that we saw that indicated still a mediocre C- grade. Number one, sectors like transit, wastewater, and others have staggering maintenance deficits. But we know that developing a clear picture of where the available funding is most needed improves overall system performance and public safety. Our message here was it's hard to be resilient if we don't have a good state of good repair, and resilience starts with maintaining our assets. A second trend that we did see in certain areas, including inland waterways, ports, and drinking water, the federal government has meaningfully increased investment, and we're seeing the results. We saw over the 4-year period a lot of state and local governments passing ballot measures, passing state legislation to increase funding for infrastructure. Until very recently, we had seen a number of states raising their gas tax to fund critical transportation investments. In fact, 37 states had raised their gas tax since 2010 to fund infrastructure improvements. You may have noticed in many of your states, we're kind of taking a troubling turn there with the impacts of inflation, putting a pause on the gas tax, which a lot of folks don't realize. In a lot of states and at the federal level, the gas tax funds not only roads and bridges, but transit systems as well. 98%, a staggering 98% of local infrastructure ballot initiatives passed in the year 2020. So when you do see infrastructure on the ballot, voters support it. They want to invest. They know that this is kind of a core function of government. And finally, we saw sectors where their data was scarce or unreliable. Sectors, we do grade schools, which a lot of people aren't aware of. School facilities, levees, and stormwater suffer from a lack of robust condition information or an inventory of assets. We're still mapping out where the nation's levees are across this country. To target investments and allocate funding, routine, reliable data needs to be collected, aggregated, and reported is a policy solution that we had. And I had a question right before during the break about, we have the grades and we advocate for investment, but do you have policy solutions? And I won't get into all of them today, but we do indeed, in each of our 17 categories, have very specific policy recommendations on how to raise the grades. They don't make the headlines in the news articles, but we absolutely, in addition to advocating for that increased funding that we need, want to optimize those investments. I apologize. When I did the slide translation, it gave me some wacky 80s colors that you see here, but the other news besides the grades that comes out are the investment needs. So this is the other news out of the report card. And our most recent analysis in this 2021 report revealed that while we've made some gains in some of the categories, our long-term investment gap continued to grow. And I should say this is pre-infrastructure law that I'm talking about. We're still just paying about half of our infrastructure bill, and the gap grew over 10 years from 2.1 trillion to 2.59 trillion across all of the categories that you see here. This is not just a federal government problem. This is at all levels of government, and the private sector is how we expect and how we've been advocating to close that gap. Surface transportation, which includes roads, bridges, transit, remained relatively steady with just a slight bump in the gap, but it is about half the total need. We did see a big jump in investment needs for water, wastewater, and stormwater. That was the biggest jump in needs from 2017. There's a couple of factors for this. One is that we added a category in 2021 of stormwater. We do continue to see a lot of the water infrastructure approaching its end of its service life. I think we have a better understanding of resilience, and a lot of the utilities are kind of building that into their estimates. And then we did a little bit of analysis, or perhaps our economists did, on looking at what EPA did not cover in their needs surveys for those assets. Another number to highlight here is the dams investment gap. That gap doubled from 40 billion to 81 billion. That was primarily due to a more comprehensive inventory of the nation's dams. So we have a better sense of the problem now. Parks, a bright spot. The Great American Outdoors Act helped to decrease the 10-year funding gap significantly. It shrunk from 102 billion to 68 billion over 10 years. But I know these numbers are kind of eyes glazing over numbers. So to try to kind of translate that for the average American household, we took those big numbers and we, with our economists, boiled them down to what does it mean for a family? Because we got that question over the years of, so what that we have a D+ or a C- in our infrastructure grades? What does that mean to me? You know, the broken water pipes that maybe shut down a business, or you have to take a road detour or bridge detour because it's closed. The blackouts and brownouts. We attempted to kind of look at the impact of unreliable, deficient infrastructure on the nation's economy. And we found, not surprisingly, it kind of acts on it like a drag on the nation's economy. And that translates to the average American household spending $3,300 a year due to infrastructure deficiencies. That's not just inconvenient, it's costing us real money. And so we found that that's kind of a compelling way to talk with people about what this problem costs us. And just to highlight one of the categories, and this was actually our biggest jump from 2017, up from a D to a C-, and that was drinking water. Our nation's drinking water infrastructure is made up of 2.2 million miles of underground pipes that deliver safe, reliable water to millions of people. Yet the system's aging and underfunded. There's a water main break every 2 minutes. However, what we saw was the rate of improvement is increasing. It's estimated that 12,000 miles of water pipes were planned to be replaced by drinking water utilities across the country in the year 2020 alone. So that was a really strong signal. In 2019, about a third of all utilities had a robust asset management program, in place to help prioritize their capital and O&M investments with limited dollars. That's up from 20% in 2016. So rest assured, this is a talking point we're using when we go to Capitol Hill, when we talk to policymakers, and they start to kind of see the value there of asset management. So I know it's a lot of doom and gloom for after lunch, so I will pivot to a positive. And some of this might be repetitive for you, although we found, there was a recent Politico poll that only 24% of American voters knew that that infrastructure law had passed. So hopefully I'm sprinkling in something new as well. But we did have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act answer the call a little bit of this kind of chronic underfunding in infrastructure. The bill was signed almost a year ago in last November, and it was 1.2 trillion in total funding over 10 years. So if you recall that investment needs gap, it does not completely solve the problem, but it is a significant down payment. And a couple things just to highlight about this legislation. One thing that makes it kind of historic and pivotal is that it invests in all 17 categories of infrastructure assessed. I see my typo there in the report card. That is really unique at the federal level. Traditionally, you would have a surface transportation bill, you'd have a water resources bill, you might deal with energy separately, all of these kind of siloed investments. Now they took a holistic look with this one-time investment in infrastructure. In addition, the largest ever investment in resilient infrastructure, over 50 billion. And we know the return on investment of infrastructure, but like to point out to a lot of groups that it's 1.4 trillion of economic activity over 8 years. And when I talk about infrastructure, talking about the report card categories, we're not talking about building facilities, but roads, bridges, water, energy, et cetera. So I wanted to point out a few things that we like in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I'll just caveat by saying, for those of you that are ASCE members, you might have seen our member resource portal, but would encourage you to check it out because there's hundreds of new programs. This is really behemoth legislation. And the White House put out a 450-page guidebook on the plan itself. So if you don't want to look at the 450 pages, what we're doing at ASCE is just kind of by report card category, putting up anytime we see a notice of funding opportunity or a regulatory, comment period that's opening, anything pertaining to what our members do, we'll put it in this portal and have that accessible, just to help kind of, sift through all the opportunities there. There's a lot of money in existing programs, but there's hundreds of new competitive grant programs as well. And I know those of you working in kind of local government, you're now eligible for funds that you were never eligible for before. And it's can be overwhelming and daunting, but we want to make sure we're kind of making sure nobody misses an opportunity there. In addition, I would say the administration has done a really nice job of being very communicative, offering stakeholder webinars, lots of, how to do a cost benefit analysis for a particular grant program. There's a lot of resources out there if you're unsure where to start or if you're not sure if you're eligible for particular funds. But we went through and tried to pick out a few highlights. These are very high level of, elements within the bipartisan infrastructure law that emphasize O&M or state of good repair. So starting with transit, you might have noticed on the grade sheet, transit was our lowest grade in 2021. They had a D-, near failing, and that's certainly not indicative of every transit system, but there's a lot of tales of two cities where there's larger cities that might have been able to pass local ballot initiatives to fund transit and others that are just falling woefully behind with maintenance backlogs and aging fleets. So there is almost $5 billion for transit state of good repair grants included in this bill. The eligible uses include transit asset management plans. And that's a good thing because 40% of buses and 23% of rail are in fair or poor condition. Rail, which an interesting time to say this was our highest grade in 2021. That's really reflective of a lot of the private investment on the freight rail side. They, at least from our analysis, found they do a decent job maintaining their assets and investing in their own rail network and have a good idea of where their maintenance issues are. So overall, a high grade of B, but yet passenger rail, those assets are falling behind. So we did see in the rail category some funds, particularly for Amtrak and states along the Northeast corridor, to develop an asset management plan or aligned with their capital investment plans. If you're familiar with the Northeast corridor, you know there's a lot of legacy infrastructure with large needs. So this was welcome, considering they have a $32 billion funding need along the Northeast corridor. And then I know you've talked a bit about water already, and we covered that drinking water was a C- and in mediocre condition, but with recent events in Jackson, Mississippi, and of course we had Flint, we know that some communities are much worse off and have failing infrastructure and kind of chronic underfunding and management issues as well. So we were pleased to see a lot of the water funding is in the state revolving loan fund program, but there was 50 million set aside annually to help those really small water systems, and there are many of them, develop asset management plans. And this is an area where the eligible grant applicants might be new to the space, include local governments, tribes, nonprofits. It includes things like technical assistance to help with long-term O&M sustainability. There is a 10% match requirement, similar to many other grants, but it could be waived in certain circumstances. And in the roads category, roads was a D in 2021. And as many of you know, asset management plans for highways were first required in MAP 21, and the bipartisan infrastructure law builds off FAST Act era policy. Specifically, the new law requires consideration of extreme weather and resilience as part of the life cycle cost and risk management analysis within a state asset management plan. Additionally, the bill directs federal aid funds and highway construction to support progress towards achievement of performance targets in each state's asset management plan for the national highway system. So again, this is scratching the surface. I know we've got some panels this afternoon that can probably dive into the details, but some things we wanted to pull out in the existing legislation. So a few years ago, we decided that, in line of one of the key solutions in our report card has been a focus on life cycle cost and asset management. We wanted to do a little bit of translating to policymakers on the benefits of optimizing investments, and we called it changing the infrastructure equation. So the idea of you can make a better use of existing limited dollars with some of these high-level strategies in place. And we started this kind of white paper with doing a survey with Route 50 magazine, which some of you might be familiar with. They do a lot of outreach with local governments, and we surveyed our own civil engineer members as well and tried to see, is there a better understanding of asset management strategies among civil engineers versus local governments? And we saw a little bit of a disconnect there, or a desire from local governments and civil engineers to have greater leadership support and political support for asset management practices. I think it was about 25% of respondents said they needed greater support from the top to employ some of these plans. They needed additional funding, and it was about 15% were still kind of relying on manual records instead of more sophisticated technology. So that was kind of our level set there. You see some of the recommendations. Again, these are very kind of high level on how you might start such a plan. And we're really, again, talking not to asset management experts, but to policymakers about including some more incentives and new grant programs and a look at life cycle costs. Because of course, the upfront cost when you're building new infrastructure, and there's a concern now with the new infrastructure bill, the shiny object projects. If we don't have the funds in place to do the O&M long-term, if we're not celebrating the kind of bread and butter maintenance projects, we're missing an opportunity to optimize those funds. So we wanted to lift some of those up, the less glamorous projects, but in a lot of the ways, the most necessary, and make sure that as much funding as possible could be directed towards these type of strategies. So with that, I wanted to leave some time for questions or discussion, and thank you for having me this afternoon.
Hello. Hi, I'm Keith. I'm from JO. Nice to meet you. I deal mostly with real property, the buildings, and we also suffer from the lack of O&M funds. What are some ways that you found in civil engineering that you can highlight the importance of those projects, not just the new construction?
I mean, I'll start it off, but then I would love to hear what others in the audience kind of working on some of those projects are doing as well. I mean, I think, you know, I was with a group of mayors and city council members, and I think having the ribbon cuttings for those O&M projects, or technology upgrades, it might not have quite the photo op, but those are, you know, those are equally, if not more valuable. So I think being visible is something we've talked a lot about, and working with your kind of public affairs team to be visible, put an op-ed in the paper, talk about these kind of hidden assets or, you know, projects that aren't obvious, and draw them out, because if we're not talking about it constantly, I think they get overlooked. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It's a great idea. Is there a way to work in the O&M funds up front when you're building something to also kind of require a reserve fund or require reinvestment over time? That's one of the things we're thinking about with buildings.
I'm going to see if any, I mean,
Chris, do you know anything about that?
Chris Vick, Bureau of Reclamation. So, you know, the rule of thumb is 80% of all costs come after construction. That's the operation and maintenance phase, and closing that project out or retiring that asset. So that's something that we consider as an agency. We always consider, you know, that 80% chunk during that initial planning phase and design phase, which is usually about 20% of the actual cost. Does that answer the question?
And we actually, having come from a municipally owned utility, there are laws that prevent that from happening, because municipally owned, you're nonprofit, you're allowed a cash reserve, and at least, you know, Moody's and Fitch and Standard & Poor's have been recommending for a good bond rating to increase that to almost like 270 days of operating for cash reserves. But most municipalities are actually not allowed to build up a cash reserve, and that's what capital's for. So yeah, we realize with infrastructure there's a litany of laws that kind of need to be refreshed with the new way of thinking.
Scott Graves with the FAA. I know in our case, when we do capital buys like this, we got 3 years to spend it and it has to go away, or our finance people will just scour it up and give it to somebody else. So no, we don't get to do that.
I have a question for you, Emily, two actually.
Sure.
For schools category, does that go all the way through to public colleges and universities?
Good question. No, it is K through 12.
K through 12. And is there any consideration to adding a category for public hospitals?
I believe we have had that posed to us before, and one of the things that we look at is as the ASCE report card is, do we have enough civil engineer experts working on a particular category to assess and evaluate, but certainly an important one. And I know another one that we dipped our toe into this time, but didn't feel we had enough information to give a grade was broadband. So we had been asked a number of cycles, you know, do you look at broadband? And at first we said civil engineers don't do broadband, and then we realized that wasn't a good enough answer.
Yeah,
So,
well, for the hospitals, let's just draft some electrical and mechanical engineers so
I
we can do it.
hear you. Yeah. Sure, good question. I do have a methodology slide that I did not include, but so for those categories, we start with our Committee on America's Infrastructure, made up of ASCE members with expertise in each of the categories. But then we're really relying, in addition to our staff team, on federal publicly available information whenever possible. That is our first choice, is to get aggregated national data on these assets. I think sometimes there's a misconception. We're going out and looking at the bridges and the water pipes. No, we're really looking at national data wherever we can, working with EPA, US DOT. We'll start talking to them 2 years in advance about when's your next set of information coming out. We want to be able to include the latest and greatest in the report card. And then we have criteria which we use to evaluate the grades. And those also did not include that, but those include capacity, condition, public safety, funding, resilience, operations and maintenance, and innovation. And operations and maintenance is a criteria where we've really tried to get better on our key indicators. Talking to federal agencies, talking to local governments about how can we evaluate how we're doing when it comes to O&M, and would love to hear your thoughts on that, any within your specific expertise. But
Rails, the highest rating
mhm.
would be. Having been on the rails in Japan, also being in rails in the United States, I don't understand why that would be.
We do get that comment a lot, and we lump together passenger rail and freight rail. So I think in a lot of, freight rail is bringing up the grade with just, they've, invested 20 billion a year in their rail network. Passenger rail is bringing down the grade. We've also contemplated, should we break that category into two and look at passenger rail and freight rail separately?
But it seems to me that may never be gauge rail. Europe, as well as Japan, much wider than it is in the United States. When the United States was established by Abraham Lincoln, it remained that. I don't think that would be determined back at one time.
And what's the benchmark?
Whatever the 4-year prior number is, we are not, that's another question that we get. We're not grading ourselves against other countries. We're grading
Can I
against
just,
ourselves.
I wanted to just add a comment to the previous question around rail. I've just joined the CAI, the scorecard committee. So I've been working with
good.
them to explore the rail sector. So so I wanted. Yeah.
Great. I've seen your name on the list, so it's
I'm
nice to
next
see you.
up. Yeah. So just on that, you talked about Japan there. I think it's important to recognize that when you look at the US rail network, there is large parts of it, like 90-something% of it, which is slow moving, heavy freight. And it does it pretty well, actually. So that's the reason why you've got, a fairly good score. If you were to stick a bullet train on that, you'd have a disaster. So we've got to sort of recognize that from a customer service level point of view, that asset is actually functioning, and it's functioning fine. If we change that and we move the needle on what we're expecting of the asset, and we certainly see that on the Northeast Corridor as we're expecting, more trains, faster trains, more reliable trains, then you're not going to score as strongly. But again, 90-something% of the network is slow moving, heavy freight trains. So. So you've got for sectors like rail, you've got to break it down further than that, because there's an awful lot of different types of rail, you know.
So the staff meeting as the mechanisms are, I want to point out that the process is working. And I would say that the ASCE scorecard has done more to bring awareness to need within IIJA than anything else. So thank you for that. We have one more comment.
Okay, I'm Kyle Christensen. I'm an architect and with Roth Integrated Asset Management. Just a comment about the rails. Last year, I did an assessment of Amtrak facilities. They were in the process of segmenting their rails from their facilities. And I was responsible for taking care of their 28 largest facilities, but found they really didn't know what they had. That was a problem in the very beginning. I don't know what they knew about their rails, but about their facilities, they didn't know, but they've got it now. So that's good. Now, the school issue is what I wanted to address. Was the infrastructure plan had 100 billion to get to start. It went to 80 billion and then it went to zero when it was passed. The average school needs 4.3 million and there's 21,000 schools. So, and that just, the 80 billion would take care of this year's problems, just to get a good condition. It doesn't take care of next year's problems. So we're way behind. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were about why that was taken out.
Great point. And yeah, we were disappointed to see that kind of dwindle down. Especially because, again, I mentioned wouldn't want my kid to bring home a C-. Also think it's terrible we're letting our school facilities fall into disrepair when you think about they spend 8 or more hours there a day. And would you see a commercial office space look like some of these schools? A lot of what we looked at in that category was, the fact that half of them needed updated HVAC facilities, energy efficient, a lot of talk about energy efficiency, but just kind of like basic needs. So that is something we are trying to kind of put a finer point on. There's some of these categories where there's just not a lot of voices at the table, frankly, talking about the needs. Dams is one where we've done a lot of work to kind of prioritize, but schools I would put up there as well. So we're hopeful, again, this is something to celebrate the infrastructure law, but we've got a lot more work to do and future legislation. There's a lot of other bills that fund infrastructure and we're hopeful to make it a higher priority, but thanks for bringing up that category.